Let me ask a follow-up question. Let me kind of put that out to everyone. I've heard the argument that, one entity, whether that's a government or an industry player, it isn't necessarily going to be able to cover all the bases for the vast variety of unmanned operations that are likely to occur. So you've got everything from package delivery to unmanned transportation, urban air mobility, like Anna talked about, and everything in between, very small drones and surveying and construction and so forth. Do you have an opinion on that, or you think that this is going to sort of evolve naturally?
I go ahead. I have an opinion, but you go first.
You have a strong opinion. You go first, and then I'll go.
Thank you. So no, I think that there's probably, in my opinion, an over-reliance on centralization, whether that be through a government provider or through an industry provider. I think one of the potential benefits of aircraft that have some sort of their own brains on board, to not put it very technically, is that they can do self-deconfliction. And I would personally prefer to see more emphasis being put on how do we standardize around that and how do we make sure that everything in the airspace is speaking a common language, rather than on trying to centralize who does what or divvy up that pie. There's probably always going to be a role for a centralized oversight, but I think that role could be very minimal and result in a much more robust system if we have good vehicle-to-vehicle communication and sort of self-deconfliction and self-organization. The technology is more or less there to be able to do that. And I think what we're lacking is sort of the willpower to push it into fruition. So it's a very different model than the voice-based aircraft to control tower model that those of us that have cut our teeth in the current aviation environment are used to. But I think it has a lot of potential to allow us to use aviation in many more ways and at a much greater scale than what we can do with any sort of centralized scheme, regardless of who the players are. So I would like to see a shift towards more vehicle to vehicle and less centralizing around any entity, personally.
Well, this is the future of unmanned systems. So you're talking about the future, and what we're seeing too is, we're on projects that are doing either one or the other, a little bit of both. And North Dakota is a great example of that. They've been very successful in getting beyond visual line of sight waivers, and a lot of it has to do with putting in infrastructure that they're used to, surveillance, technology, and things like that. And that's what we're doing with partners. Thales Group is leading the way for beyond visual line of sight infrastructure for the entire state. Hopefully that will be in place in the next 18 months. That's the plan. But it's centralized, but it's interesting that the state has funded a lot of the infrastructure and the team to manage that platform going forward. So in some cases, we're having to use existing processes to move the industry forward. And we're seeing that in some areas. In other areas, trying to do it a bit differently, but it's slowing down. So it's a little bit of how much does it cost, and can we get radar systems be lower in the infrastructure? And in some cases, we're just putting it in to make it work today, knowing that it'll probably change in a few years from now to what you're talking about.
Yeah, definitely agree with what you just said. And then with you too, Anna, that definitely this could be the desired end state, to have this much more decentralized. Some regions and some countries went for a very pragmatic approach to say, hey, let's start with something a bit more centralized because it enables us to move faster. But what we see is they're really aware that it has to move to something more federated and decentralized. But it's probably a stepped approach.
Yep.
Don?
Yeah, Don.
Yeah, so this is an interesting problem because in weather, the government has provided most of the weather data services to the aviation industry. And this has been a choke point for innovation in weather because people now expect their data to be free. But yet we could be doing a lot better in our resolution. We have about 40% of flights that are delayed due to weather probably could fly if there was more certainty in the atmosphere about what was really happening. And so what we're trying to do, True Weather, is trying to change the business model around aviation for the drones and the air taxi industry, because we realize that if you try to centralize weather around a centralized system like the FAA, you're not going to get the innovation you need to fill the data gaps, because the government will never be able to afford the infrastructure required for us to close those gaps that today we know are going to be very impactful to the UAS industry. In fact, the FAA funded a study by MIT Lincoln Lab that says all the current weather data available through the aviation system is not adequate for the UAS industry. And that has a lot to do with the fact that they fly low level. There's not a lot of data. You're flying in the weather. You got to worry about clouds and visibility. You can't fly in IFR and all this stuff, especially as we move to the BV loss in the future, the beyond visual line of sight. This is going to become very, very impactful. And so we are advocating for more decentralized approaches to weather support to the industry. Now, the one area where it does get a little challenging, as Laurent said, is this idea of authoritative source, right? So when it comes to airspace management, the challenge is that you have to have all aircraft operating under the same idea about what that weather is going to be. Otherwise, when you do deconfliction, you're going to run into problems, right? So that's the one piece that we're working on and trying to figure out how to solve that. I still don't think it's a national authority doing it. I think it would be more localized, and maybe maybe one company or one entity would own that airspace for that specific thing only for weather. But these are the things we're looking at. And I think federated is definitely the way to go if we want innovation and if we want to solve these problems that we're going to have coming forth.
So let me ask you this, John. Do you think that this is one area, particularly where you might actually see the manned aircraft several years from now taking some of the technology from the unmanned aircraft and saying, hey, they might be actually doing it better or having a more successful model?
Well, this is interesting you bring this up, because I was an author of, in 2005, the Next Generation Air Traffic Management. I was in the Air Force at the time, and I was representing the Air Force and writing the weather ConOps for Next Gen. And, we had so many great ideas about how to increase velocity and traffic and moving aircraft in and out and using weather information as a way to try to smooth that out and save money. But man, here we are, it's 15 years later, and to try to get a legacy, framework and with technical debt and trying to get people to change the way they do business it's really difficult, right? So I looked at this is why I'm doing this, is I saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate what's really possible with a new system, right? And working with modern software and modern architectures like Laurent's building and Michael's building and others, that we can show what's possible. So I do think that we're going to learn a lot about how we can improve, our weather data, situational awareness, crowdsourcing weather data that today you can't do because the federal government says you got to certify an instrument at an airfield, which costs about $200,000 for that instrument set that we can never get out and make ubiquitous. And we're fighting for, hey, we want to certify data, not instruments, right? And that's this whole UTM and UAS and all this stuff has opened these possibilities up. So yes, I think we are going to learn a lot, and hopefully it will apply to the future and help move things along.
Great. So I want to move on to a concept that's sort of inherent in all of, or not all, many of the future applications that we see. And I think that all of our panelists here deal with this in some different way, shape, or form. And that's flight beyond visual line of sight. So I just wrote an article recently that said sort of midterm to long-term deliveries could actually be a bigger market than short-term deliveries. But there are just a lot of values to cargo, UAM. A lot of the future applications that we talk about do require flying beyond visual line of sight. And enabling beyond visual line of sight requires so many different pieces to come together. There's the weather situation and enabling that way. There's regulations and so forth. So let me start with you, Michael, and say, when it comes to BVLOS flight, what do you think is needed to kind of unlock the potential there for the drone industry?
It's really about safety. Everything that has to do with flying beyond visual line of sight has to do safety. And that probably gets into our last discussion about using existing infrastructure that is known and works today helps us get across the line. So there's multiple areas, whether it be communications, understanding communications, what are your backups, what are the risks, what happens if you drop communications. Now we're getting certification, and there's been a lot of big news over the summer about type certification 135 and freight delivery, and that is airworthiness. And I think we're headed towards a performance-based situation. So you put in your type of aircraft, what's the probability of it crashing? Now take that probability and apply that to what are you about to fly over? How many people are there? How many roads? What's the speed limits on the roads? What's the traffic count? What are the population changes per hour? And then adjust is that a 10 to the 7th power probability of crashing? And if so, what are safety measures can you put onto that? If you fly at 400 feet with a parachute, what is the probability of it opening before 200 feet? So all of that goes into these calculations that are having to be used to create these waivers. And it's taking 6 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get approved for one flight. And it's taking everything we're learning from these different companies that have blazed the trail and spent tons of money and automating as much of that as we can. But also we have to use some of the traditional technology and combining that together with collision avoidance systems on board, but also deconfliction and things that were traditionally to open up the market. That's what I'm seeing is if you can prove safety and repeatability, that is what's going to open this up. And we're starting to see it happen in certain areas. And like I said, we're learning a lot from North Dakota, and to the point we're already starting to apply what the learnings from there down to Michigan and now to Arizona. We started to work with Arizona Commerce Authority and the Institute for Digital Progress to start to take the learnings from there and start to apply them in Arizona as well. Is how can we start to move on this with what we have today versus still waiting? And that's what we're starting to see is all the learnings, still manual to get there, but supporting those people that have the Type 135 certifications to move to the next step.